All right, let's get more on China's campaign to eat less meat with Peter Knights, live from San Francisco. He's the co-founder and executive director of WildAid, an NGO dedicated to cutting demand for wildlife products. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Good evening. How are you?
So, Peter, as we just discussed, the Chinese government has outlined a plan to cut its citizens' meat consumption by 50%. They've drawn up new dietary guidelines suggesting smaller portions of meat. What is behind this initiative?
Well, this is primarily a health initiative. The rates of heart disease, obesity, diabetes are skyrocketing in China as a response to a higher meat diet, largely. And so this is a health concern that's prompted this. But as you mentioned in your piece, there are massive implications for climate change in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, water supplies. So this is really an incredibly positive move.
Well, Peter, the guidelines are merely suggestions. They're basically unenforceable. China's pork imports are growing at an annual rate of 150% a year. So the signs point to a very steep growth in China's demand for meat. These are just guidelines. Do you expect any kind of turnaround here?
Well, as you say, the projections, should nothing happen, are for China to basically catch up with the per capita consumption of the United States. And of course, the size of the country, that's a huge increase. So we're fighting an uphill battle to begin with. But when you start to stack up the arguments in favor of less meat consumption, it's a pretty convincing case, whether it's for your own health, your own longevity, whether it's for your impact on the planet and stopping climate change, whether it's for water resources, or whether it's animal welfare. The case for eating less meat is pretty conclusive. And we believe if a lot of people get to that case properly, more people will try eating less meat. And once you try, it really isn't that hard. I think it'd be very difficult to try and get people to go vegan or vegetarian. But eating less meat is something we can all do very easily.
Well, they've enlisted some star power. Arnold Schwarzenegger director James Cameron. Arnie has the public service announcement asking Chinese to terminate their meat eating. Are there any indications that this kind of star power may actually yield some results?
Well, Governor Schwarzenegger is working with a whole selection of Chinese celebrities, people like Li Bingbing. And the governor's position is this: his doctor has advised him that he must eat less meat. So he's not a vegetarian himself, but he's been cutting back his meat consumption gradually for health concerns. And I think that's what the goal should be here, not to try and get everyone to be vegan or vegetarian, but just to start considering more their diet and cutting back, and particularly eating less red meat, which is particularly damaging to the environment and your health.
Well, Peter, there's also a cultural element at play, because eating meat is viewed as an important part of a middle-class diet, and having pork on the table is a sign of social status in China. So how can you challenge that cultural perception?
Well, there's a lot of cultural perceptions that have to be challenged here. In the governor's message, as you heard, he said, you don't need to have to eat meat to get stronger, because I think there's this notion, there's even the term in English, beefy, suggesting that, if you're big and brawny, it's because of meat consumption, when, you don't need that meat to achieve that. So there's a lot of myths that have to be broken down. And I think, when you look at China in general these days, things are changing so rapidly. As you pointed out, it wasn't that long ago that the meat consumption was a lot less. So when we're not talking about something here that's been established for decades and decades, it's a relatively new situation. And really what we're saying is get back to a more traditional Chinese diet, which was much lower in meat and much healthier.
Well, now China accounts for half of global consumption and production of pork and 28% of all the world's meat. So if this is effective and less pork and meat are consumed, what about the economic implications that this is going to have on the pork and meat industry globally?
Well, all things excluding that, if you look at the meat industry overall, it's projected to increase by something like 70% globally as places like Africa increase their consumption. So overall, globally, even if China was to cut, we may be still just staying at the same level. But of course, people aren't going to stop eating because they don't eat meat. There's many other things they'll eat. So a lot of that meat consumption, meat production, could be replaced with soy production, other types of vegetable foods. So this isn't a zero-sum game. Something will have to be eaten in exchange for meat, and those are products that very often are more often grown in China. So for beef example, most of the beef is going to be imported, and so that's actually going out of China, whereas what we'd much prefer, what's better for everybody in climate terms and in economic terms as well, I think, is for homegrown food, locally grown food, which is much more plant-based.
Well, Peter, very quickly, do you expect other countries to follow and have these types of guidelines distributed as well?
Well, Europe has already, in some places, has got guidelines urging less meat consumption. Unfortunately, here in the United States, they were going to put that in their guidelines, and then the meat lobby pushed back, and that was removed. But it's common sense from both a point of view of saving healthcare costs, saving people's lives, increasing health, as well as the immense environmental impact of excessive meat consumption.
All right. Thanks so much, Peter. Peter Knights, co-founder and executive director of WildAid.